Part 3 for the story of Shimshon. In order to understand the actual story of Shimshon, which will begin now, it's very important to jump back many, many years to the story of Yaakov. Before Yaakov passed away, he gathered all his children together. Yaakov passed away in the year 2255, which is 555 years before Shimshon was the judge. This is a long time earlier. And Yaakov blessed his children before he passed away. And when he came to his son Don, he gave Don 3 pesukim, 3 verses in the Torah dedicated to blessing his son Don. And aside from Yehuda and Yosef, no other single shevet got 3 pesukim aside for Don. So Don got a massive bracha, 3 pesukim long, from his father Yaakov before he passed away. And as we're going to mention, these 3 verses, these 3 pesukim are all about a future person to be born to the tribe of Dan many, many years down the line, Shimshon. So the actual verses itself. The first one is, and I'll read it in English, Dan will, Yodiname, will govern his people as one of the tribes of the Jewish people. Verse number 2, Dan will be a serpent by the road, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels so that its rider is thrown backwards. That's verse number 2. Again, very, very specific bracha, a blessing from Yaakov. And the third one is, Lishuascha kivisi Hashem, I wait for your deliverance, Hashem. 3 verses long, dedicated to Dan. And Rashi, for example, says that all the Jewish people will be like one with him, and he will avenge them all. This is what Yaakov is blessing his son Dan. And Rashi says this prophecy is about Shimshon. And it describes Shefifoin, which is the word in the verse. Rashi says it's a snake. And then Rashi points out in the actual story how you see Shimshon's behavior was compared to a snake. And we'll talk about that soon. The Medrash Rabbah, in fact, brings proofs about the connection between a snake and Shimshon. There's a whole list in Medrash Rabbah. But some of the connections is, just as a snake went to Chava, at the very beginning of humanity, the very first story of humanity, the snake went to Chava to convince her to eat from the tree. So too Shimshon would be hanging around snakes, around women. The snake was with Chava, Shimshon was like a snake, and so he was found among women. Another interesting similarity that Medrash Rabbah brings, among many others, is that the power of a snake is in its head. And another one, and the same thing you see with Shimshon, additional difference that Medrash Rabbah brings down is that a poison, like the weapon of choice of whether they chose or not, but the weapon that a snake has is poison. And the poison continues long after the snake is dead. The snake doesn't have to be alive for the poison to be activated. If the poison is somewhere and someone ingests it, it could still kill them. Shimshon managed to kill so many more people after he had already died than during his entire lifetime combined. And we'll get to there in the upcoming podcasts. Additionally, there's another Medrash Rabbah, and the Medrash Rabbah says like this, Bereshis Rabbah. It says like this: Yaakov saw the story of Shimshon far in advance, 555 years before the story of Shimshon. And when he saw the story of Shimshon, he believed, says the Medrash Rabbah, that Shimshon was the King Mashiach, was the Mashiach that's going to redeem the Jewish people. Again, Shimshon is right at the end of the era of the judges. It would be very appropriate that after all the judges, the last one would be the Mashiach. And Shimshon saw Shimshon and believed he was Mashiach. And then when he died, Yaakov said, this one too dies. And then straight away, Yaakov comforted himself, and this is the 3rd verse, and he says, I wait for your deliverance, Hashem. And as the commentators explain, instead of giving up, Yaakov continued to await, Yaakov continued to have hope that the salvation of Hashem will come through the King Mashiach. So even though Shimshon's story ended tragically with his passing, nonetheless, Yaakov continued to await the coming of Mashiach. But what's really interesting is, until he died, Yaakov was under the impression that Shimshon was Mashiach. Again, it really gives us a very, very good idea of who we're dealing with. And again, we're trying to break apart the misnomer that Shimshon was some regular person, some person who was blessed with great blessings, but was just a regular person. Shimshon was an incredibly righteous person, a person who Yaakov believed was the King Mashiach, until he saw the end of the story. But until the end, he believed Shimshon was Mashiach, and that's very important. The Maharzu on Medrash Rabbah says that Yaakov saw that Shimshon's mother, Salal Foinis, came from the tribe of Yehuda, and that's the reason why he said, he could be Mashiach because he doesn't have to be from the father's side. The Eitz Yosef has a bit of a problem with it and says, wait a second, Shimshon doesn't come from Yehuda. Shimshon comes from the tribe of Dan. And so the Eitz Yosef gives another really fascinating answer about a special warrior from the tribe of Yehuda who will come at the time of Mashiach. Not that he himself will be Mashiach, but he'll be at the time of Mashiach. Very interesting discussion, but we'll move on. Additionally, in addition to Yaakov, there was also another prophecy in regards to Shimshon that happened long before Shimshon was even born. On the last day of Moshe's life, Moshe blessed all the tribes. He learned from his great-grandfather Yaakov to do that. And about Dan, he says really interesting. He says, Dan is a lion cub that leaps forth from Bashan. Again, there's a lot to unpack in this, but the Abarbanel says, and he quotes the Ralbag, the Ralbag and the Abarbanel both say the same thing. They say, Ha-Bashan is... Min HaBashan, is a reference to Shimshon. One of the biggest miracles that happened to Shimshon happened from between his teeth. And we'll talk about that when we get there. And so they say this is a reference. Min HaBashan sounds like Mi Bein Shinov. And so the Abarbanel, the Ralbag, says this is Moshe giving blessings to Shimshon, who he perceives far in the distance is going to do incredible things to the Jewish people. So in addition to the earlier two podcasts where we kind of jump-started the story of Shimshon and explained, an angel coming to predict this incredible child's birth, in addition to that, both Yaakov and Moshe both predicted and prophesied about Shimshon's story far before he was born. So Shimshon's being raised with a lot of pressure because he has an angel foretelling his tale after his parents waited for decades for him to be born, and now two incredible prophecies from earlier on in history are clearly referencing him. Shimshon began ruling in the year 2810, and which is 322 years from the time when the Jewish people arrived in Israel. So they've already been in Israel for a good amount of time, and just for a little bit of context, it's a little under 3,000 years ago the story of Shimshon occurred. Now, before we get to the actual beginning of Shimshon, there's a really interesting Avas Yonasan by Yonas Neibshitz. He says that Manoach was a Gilgul of Noach. Noach. So from Noach. Noach was a reincarnation of Noach. Noach was born, lived a very long life, came back again, and in his first life he was supposed to have 4 sons. Shem, Ham, Yafes, Shimshon. But then the incident of the wine, drinking the wine, getting drunk, his son Ham harmed him, disabling him from having a 4th son, which is a story of its own we're not going to explore. And Noach wasn't able to have his 4th son, Shimshon. So he had to come back again, explains the Avos Yonasan. And in his second reincarnation, at least according to the way the Avos Yonasan explains it, Shimshon was then born. And the Plishtim, who were descendants of Ham, who had harmed Shimshon's father in the earlier life, Shimshon spent the rest of his life avenging their behavior, or their ancestors' behavior, to his ancestor in an earlier life. So it's very interesting that Shimshon dedicates his life punishing the Plishtim when it was their ancestry that caused that he wasn't supposed to be born when he was really supposed to be born. Now the Seder Dose brings down, and many places bring it down, that Shimshon was also a Gilgul of Nadav and Avihu, and we're going to explain later on exactly how that all works. Additionally, Shimshon was a Gilgul, reincarnation of Esav. Now, the pasuk says like this: the woman, who's a reference to Tzel Alphonis, had a son, and she named him Shimshon, and the boy grew, and Hashem blessed him. And again, the word Hashem blessed him in the Gemara is going to be a very loaded word. And the spirit of Hashem first moved him in the camp of Dan between Sarah and Ashtar. And there's a whole discussion about where exactly this is and what it means, the encampment of Dan. But we're not gonna get bogged down with it. We want to keep on moving. And the Gemara in Sotah says it's in this area, wherever Shimshon started, the prophecy of Yaakov Avinu about Dan will be a serpent in the way and a horned snake in the path that bites the horse's heel. This is where it all began. Shimshon's prophecy began as a young boy, and what Yaakov predicted, this occurred, which Shimshon is, says the Gemara, the prophecy of Yaakov Avinu. Now, the meaning of the name of Shimshon is very interesting, because it says the woman gave a son and named him Shimshon. And what's so fascinating about this, and again, it's not a rule across the board, but it's common enough that it's a very strong question. And the commentators on the Tanakh asked this question: why is there no meaning to the name Shimshon given in the verse? His mother named him Shimshon. Usually when it says that the mother names someone something, there's a reason for the name is given. But in this case, just as the woman gave birth to a son and named him Shimshon. So in addition to wondering what does the name Shimshon actually mean? It's very curious that Shimshon's explanation to his name is not mentioned straight in the verse. Now the Gemara straight away, Soita, says that Shimshon comes from the word Shemesh. Shimshon, first three letters, Shemesh, sun. And just as Hashem is compared to a sun, Hashem is compared to the sun, and Hashem judges the world with perfect judgment, so too Shimshon judged the world with perfect judgment, and that's the reason why he's called the name Shimshon. Now, just on the side, because I can't help myself from mentioning this, the Ben Ish Chai says that there were other judges, Yeshua, Snil Mekinaz, Shmuel Anavi, they also judged with perfect judgment. And this is really important. The Ben Ish Chai says, why is the Gemara coming here to mention, Shimshon judged with perfect judgment? Of course, all Jewish leaders that are judging according to Torah judge with perfect judgment. The Gemara is trying to say that you might say, because Shimshon married a foreign woman, and again, the story of Shimshon is going to be a very complicated one to understand, and we're going to move through it slowly to try to explain what it means. A person might just read the story and say, well, Shimshon wasn't able to judge perfectly like Hashem is able to do, and Shimshon, he's not such a great person. The Ben Ish Chai says the reason why the Gemara comes to tell us this is, if you have any misgivings about Shimshon, you're quick to judge him and say, he wasn't such a great judge. The verse makes it very, very clear. Dan Yadin Amek Ke'achad Shiftei Yisrael. Shimshon judged the Jewish people like Hashem judges the Jewish people, and he judged them perfectly. And the story we need to analyze piece by piece the different parts of the story, but don't mistakenly think that Shimshon was a regular person and just a person conflicted with emotions. And Shimshon was an incredibly righteous man, incredibly righteous man, and we'll explore that as we move along. Now, the Gemara says, well, very interesting. If Shimshon has the same name of Hashem, because Shemesh means sun, and sun's a reference to Hashem, then are we allowed to destroy the name Shimshon? And the Gemara says, it's not the same, it's similar. And just as Hashem protected the whole world, so too Shimshon protected his world. In his generation, he protected the Jewish people. That's the Gemara. The Abarbanel says that Shimshon comes from the word shamash, to serve. Literally, the position in the shul called a shamash. That's where Shimshon's name comes. He served Hashem his whole life, keeping his Nazirite vows, as we explored in the first two chapters. Shimshon actually kept it, and because he actually kept it, he was like serving Hashem. Now, the third one, the second opinion in the Barbanel, really explains why Shimshon's mother didn't announce the meaning behind the name. The Barbanel says that Shimshon's name also comes from the word shemama, which means waste. Shimshon was going to lay waste to the Plishtim. As the story is going to progress, you're going to see just how incredibly he does it, and how impactful he is in his devastation to the Plishtim. He played such incredible mind games with them and managed to get all of the things he needed to do all taken care of in the most effective and the most powerful way, and he really was going to terrify the Plishtim in ways that had never been terrorized, and pretty much until the time of David HaMelech, they never will be terrorized. And so his name was Shemama, from waste, laying waste to the Plishtim. And of course, that explains easily why Shimshon's mother wasn't announcing the reasoning for the name for Shimshon, because the last thing she needed to have was the Plishtim discovering who her son was and who her son was going to be. That would be very, very bad for the story of Shimshon. So she named him Shimshon, understanding that name meant that he was going to lay devastation to the Plishtim, but at the same time, he was very quiet. She was very quiet in explaining the motivation for the naming, because she didn't want the Plishtim to get hold of her child before he became the great person that he became. The Aderes Eliyol, written by the Vilna Gaon, quotes Reb Chaim Vital and says that Shimshon was a Gilgal of Nadav ben Aharon. Aaron had four children, Nadav, Avihu, Elazar, and Isamar, and Nadav, the son of Aaron, and his brother famously went into the Mishkan, sacrificed the incense without permission. Many different reasons of why they got punished. One of them, they drank wine before going to do the services, but they died. Nadav died, and one of the things Nadav says is that there are no Jewish women that are good enough for us. And Shimshon famously later became a reincarnation of Nadav, and then he was forced to be with Plishti woman, especially in the story of the prison, and that we'll explore as we get there. But because Nadav got drunk before doing the Keteris, Shimshon was forbidden from wine from the womb. And he says you could even see the name of Shimshon is a tikkun for Nadav HaKohen, and It's a very interesting explanation by the Vilna Gaon, but the idea is that Shimshon is the reference to Badon, and Badon is Nadav. Shimshon was lame in both legs. Again, he's born, he's being raised by his parents, has the most incredible parents, and a whole bunch of characteristics of Shimshon is actually known. The Gemara lists a whole bunch of really interesting things about him. He was lame in both legs, which again makes the story really, really interesting. Obviously, as I understand it, when he needed to do the miracles, he was able to be very much mobile, but at the same time, the way he was born, he was lame in both legs. He was one of the 5 people in the world to be born with a characteristic of Hashem, and then struck by that thing itself. So Shimshon had strength, and that, of course, was what ended up striking him. Shaul had this godly-like characteristic in his neck, of Shalom, his hair, Tzidkiyahu, the last king of the Jewish people, in his eyes, and Asa in his feet. The Gemara says that Hashem blessed him. And the Gemara explains he was blessed in his actual seed, that it flowed like an overflowing river. The Gemara Saita says that we mentioned the 2 cities, Tzara and Eshtal, and the Gemara Saita says they were 2 massive mountains. Why are we mentioning where he was? It doesn't sound that important. And so Tzara and Eshtal, says the Gemara, 2 massive mountains. Shimshon picked up both mountains and crushed them against each other. That's the reason why the verse mentions these 2 mountains, because this is very, very important in understanding the early feats of Shimshon. Again, we'll discuss what the first miracle of Shimshon, or the first feat of greatness of Shimshon was. But according to the Gemara at least, Shimshon's first feats were already at a very young age. The spirit of Hashem was flowing through him, and Shimshon was already doing tremendous things, even young child, far before the famous part of the story began. Vayikra Rabbah says, Yehuda says that when the Ruach HaKodesh was on Shimshon, he could take a single step and go from Tzara to Eshtal, 2 cities entirely separate from each other, far, far away from each other. And when he was imbued with the spirit of Hashem, Shimshon was able to take a single step and leap from one city to the next city. And Reb Nachman says that when the Ruach HaKodesh was resting on Shimshon, his hair on his head would rattle like a bell. And again, that's the loaded word of bell that we mentioned in the verse. And this sound would reach from Tzara to Eshtal, so a massive distance. His hair would rattle, creating a bell-like sound that would ring out in a tremendous distance. Now, there's a really interesting Torah teaching of the Rebbe. The Rebbe explains like this, that how did the activation of Shimshon's Nazirus begin? Really, really fascinating. I'm not going to go into the whole explanation. It's brilliant and it's very long. But the Rebbe says that in order for a person to be a Nazir, there are rules. It can't be a message from an angel that activates a Nazir, that makes a person a Nazirite. And the Rebbe also analyzes the story of Shmuel Hanavi and says Shmuel Hanavi's mother swore that he would be a Nazir before he was even born. That's not how halacha works. That's not how Nazir works. So what actually happened? How was it possible for them to be activated? We see no place where they took it upon themselves, and we see no place when their father activated for them once they were born, before the age of 13. That would technically work, but we don't see it anywhere in the verse. The only thing we see in the verse is, in the case of Shimshon, the angel instructing Shimshon's mother that he's going to be a Nazir, and in the case of Shmuel Hanavi, that Shmuel Hanavi's mother promises he'll be a Nazir. So the Rebbe brilliantly aligns these 2 Nazirites, these 2 Nazirs, to the laws of conversion of a young child before Bar Mitzvah. And if a young child, together with his family, convert to Judaism, they, of course, the young boy needs to have a beis din, a Jewish court. He needs to have the mitzvah of circumcision. He needs to go to mikveh with the rest of his family, and he joins the Jewish people. But then when he turns 13, he doesn't need to retake on to be a convert. We just wait to see if he rejects it. If he rejects it, he's out. But if he doesn't reject it, then retroactively it activates the actual moment. Now, of course, the Rebbe analyzes between Rabbi Nero and Rabbi Yossi how the actual activation activates, whether the big moment is by his actual bar mitzvah, or whether it activates and it makes his big moment when he actually accepted it when he was, let's say, 6 or 7 years old. And the Rebbe re-engineers the entire end of Masechta Nazir. But what's really interesting is Shimshon's bar mitzvah would have been a very, very pivotal moment, because Shimshon's parents would have waited to see, at the age of 13, is he actually going to accept it? They raised both Shmuel Hanavi and Shimshon as a Nazir, but at 13, if either of them would have said, we don't want this anymore, the whole thing would have fallen apart. But in both cases, it didn't. Shimshon was famously a Nazir Shimshon for his whole life, and Shmuel HaNavi was a Nazir Olam, a lifelong Nazir for his entire life. So when they turned 13, they didn't object, which meant that their bar mitzvah was a very pivotal moment in their life. Shimshon's Ruach HaKodesh is described like a bell. And the Bible says the Spirit of Hashem, the level of Ruach HaKodesh that came to each judge, came slowly to Shimshon. He wasn't ready for it, so it came to him like a bell. But the Bible describes the Spirit of Hashem mentioned in the verse as actual Ruach HaKodesh. And we'll talk about that in a second. The Rambam says Shimshon reached perfection. Hashem made miracles come about through him. We're going to discuss incredible miracles, absolutely incredible miracles. And when he prayed to Hashem, he was answered, and we'll talk about that as well in upcoming podcasts. And he was on the level of prophets because Hashem only makes miracles happen to those that are worthy of it. So we're not talking about a regular child. This is an incredible, incredible man. And yes, there are parts of the story that need to be understood, but they need to be understood in the light of this is a man who's able to have the Spirit of Hashem go on him. This is a man who we'll describe later on became the leader of the Jewish people, not just a leader in the sense of a king or of a ruler, but the Torah authority, the Torah judge of the Jewish people for 20 years. A very interesting Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which is very, very famous, Pinchas ben Yair talks about how a person can reach Ruach HaKodesh. The prerequisites in order to achieve Ruach HaKodesh, in order to achieve what Shimshon had. A person needs to learn Torah, and Torah brings him to Zahiris, which is caution away from sin, and that leads a person to Zerizus, which is diligence and nothing negative comes about him, which then leads a person to Nikios, which is cleanliness from sin, which then leads a person to Prishos, which is abstinent from even permitted things, which then leads a person to Tahara, which is purity, which then leads a person to Chasidus, which is piety, and then that leads a person to humility, anava, and then yiras chet, fear of sin, and then kedusha, holiness, and then a person could reach the divine spirit. So if Shimshon is described as someone with Ruach HaKodesh, we're talking about all of these things I just listed, he has them all. So this is the person who's being raised by Tzalal Fonis Menech, not a regular man, not a person just with superpowers who's very, very clever or very, very wise or very manipulative. We're talking about a truly righteous person, a person which has real humility and real fear of sin and real piety and real purity, all of these because he reached Ruach HaKodesh. Now, before we begin the story of Shimshon actually going down to Timnah, we spoke about his childhood just now, but now the real famous part of the story is going to begin. There's two important things that we need to explain before we start the story. Number one, the Jewish people were under the control of the Plishti dictatorship at that time. The Plishti empire ruled the land of the Jewish people, and there's many verses that clearly point to that. They were under the control of the Plishtim. The Plishtim were brutal, they were cruel, they were horrible, they really oppressed the Jewish people. And Shimshon understood, and the Bible makes this clear, that if he were to attack the Plishtim, and it's very clear from the story itself, if Shimshon would attack the Plishtim, even with his superpowers and his incredible might, this spirit of Hashem, the spirit of Gevurah that imbued itself into Shimshon, the Jewish people would collectively suffer as a result. Shimshon would be a Jewish person who was attacking the Plishtim. And so the Jewish people collectively would all suffer as a result. They would attack. They would bring their armies and they would attack the Jewish people. So the Abarbanel says Shimshon understood, because of the political backdrop that was going on at the time, that Shimshon had to insert himself into the Plishtim in such a way that the actions that he would do against the Plishtim would be exclusively attributed to him and not the Jewish people. Because if it wasn't, the Jewish people would all suffer. That's point number one. That's very important to understand in the context of the story. And point number two, both the angel, the Malach, when it came to Shimshon's mother, which we discussed in the first two podcasts, and also Yaakov's message to Shimshon, comparing him to a snake, clearly shows, V'hu Yachal, says the angel, and also being compared to a snake, shows that he was supposed to be a lone warrior. Shimshon understood that he wasn't supposed to be someone that's going to inspire the Jewish people to all join together with him, but rather he needed to attack his enemies and the Jewish people's enemies by himself. The Ramban says, Sforno also brings it down, Shimshon was compared to a snake because unlike other shoftim and kings who led the Jewish people into battle, Shimshon went alone. Snakes don't hunt in packs. Snakes are lone creatures. And so Shimshon understood he's being compared to a snake. That's a message from his great-great-great-grandfather Yaakov telling him that he needs to behave in such a way. So Shimshon went down to Timnah. This is the famous beginning of the story. He sees a woman from afar, doesn't actually talk to her, from among the daughters of the Plishtim. And the Malbim says he saw her, he never talked. And he went to his parents and he told his parents, I saw a woman in Timnah from the Plishtim, the Plishti daughters, Philistines, if you want the English translation of it. Take her now for me as a wife. And the Metzudah says that when he says take, it's the word k'chu, he means he wants to marry her according to Torah. Now, of course, his parents were devastated. This is the incredible child who's been prophesied by Moshe, by Yaakov. An angel comes to tell him about the child. And so his mother and father say, are there no one among the daughters of the Jewish people, or at least of my people, that are suitable as a wife? Why must you go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Plishtim? It's a very big accusation. Shimshon's this incredibly righteous man who's been prophesied and predicted, and he's supposed to do wondrous things. And now his parents say, what are you doing? Well, you saw a woman from afar and you decide you want to marry her? And Shimshon didn't explain himself to them. He just responded, take her for me because she's appropriate in my eyes. And the word eyes is very much loaded. And Rashi says he wanted to marry her properly, but he wanted to marry her. And it says the pasuk, the father and mother didn't know that this was a decree from Hashem. They didn't know that this was what actually Hashem wanted. They were devastated, but they didn't know that this is what Hashem actually wanted. Why? Because Shimshon wanted a pretext to fight against the Plishtim, and at that time the Plishtim ruled over the Jewish people. So Shimshon, as we explained from the Bible now, and as it's very clear from the verses itself, Shimshon needed a way to insert himself into the Plishtim in such a way that it wouldn't come back against the Jewish people. Now, the word Shimshon went down, which we mentioned in the verse, Shimshon went down to the city of Timnah, is not the first time the city of Timnah is mentioned. The city of Timnah is mentioned in the story of Yehuda and Tamar. Yehuda famously marries off his daughter to Tamar, and her first husband, one of Yehuda's first son, and second son both die, and Yehuda is very hesitant to let his daughter-in-law marry his third son. So he says to wait. She sees that he's not being given over, that the third son is not being given over to her to get married, and so she goes to her father-in-law. But when she hears that her father-in-law is in the city, she hears that her father-in-law went up to Timnah. So the question is, where is Timnah? Is Timnah the top of a mountain or the bottom of a mountain? From the story of Shimshon, it's very clear that he went down, and from the story of Yehuda, it sounds like Yehuda went up. So the Gemara says, the Gemara actually brings three answers, and one says that Yehuda went up in stature because of the story of Timnah, while Shimshon was very much disgraced in the story. Another answer is that there were two different Timnahs. One you traveled by going up, another one you traveled down. And another one is that Timnah was halfway up a hill. From where Shimshon lived, he went down to the city of Timnah. From where Yehuda lived, he went up. So it's very pragmatic answers. This is the Gemara in Saita. Now, the Gemara in Saita says, very famously, and very hard to understand maybe, that Shimshon's eyes were poked out because he went after his eyes. The Gemara asks, but wait a second, doesn't it say that Shimshon's parents didn't know that this was from Hashem? Obviously, Shimshon was doing the right thing. So why is he getting, later on, his eyes get poked out at the end of the story because he went after his eyes? That sounds like it's a punishment for doing a bad behavior, but this sounds like it's from Hashem. And so the Gemara answers, although Hashem did want the Plishtim to be punished, Hashem did want Shimshon to do whatever he did, when he went, he followed his inclination. He added his own eyes into the picture, so he was punished for that. But was he doing what Hashem wanted? Yes, he was doing what Hashem wanted. And that's very, very important to understand this actual story. Shimshon was doing what Hashem wanted in this story. Hashem wanted Shimshon to defend the Jewish people, and Shimshon needed a way to inject himself. The HaKodesh the Mashah and the Marzul and Midrash Rabbah, two different locations, but both of them have a very similar understanding to the story, and said Shimshon needed to inject himself into the life of the Plishtim. He could have chosen many ways to go about it, but the way that Shimshon chose to do it was by marriage with the daughters. He could have chosen other ways. Okay, this means he went after his eyes. It didn't have to pick this way. Was it what Hashem wanted? To inject himself into the Plishtim so that he could cause that the Jewish people won't suffer as a result of his revenge against the Plishtim? Absolutely. But with the place where Hashem, when a person goes along a path, Hashem helps them. The person picks a particular path. That's the path that Hashem helps them along. In this case, Shimshon chose one that had ramifications against him. And the next uncomfortable thing we need to talk about is the woman in Timnah, the first wife of Shimshon. Did Shimshon get married to her or not? There's no explicit, not married. Did she convert or not? There's no explicit mention in the verses, in the psukim, of her actually converting. Even in the Gemara, there's no explicit mentions of her converting. The Rambam is extremely sharp on this. The Rambam says, don't let it lift up in your mind that the Shimshon who saved the Jewish people, and also mentions Shlomo HaMelech, who's called the friend of Hashem, married Gentile women who didn't convert. And the Rambam, 2 halachas later, says Shlomo converted the women he married, and similarly Shimshon converted them and married, and they might have converted with ulterior motives. And again, it's a whole discussion, but the conversion wasn't under the guidance of the courts, but at the same time, they absolutely converted before. Shimshon married women that converted before, and the Torah might have considered as if they were still non-Jewish because of the way that they were converted, but they very much did convert. 100%, that's the Rambam's opinion. The Masud Chai Rekeach, who wrote the Ma'aser Rekeach, he was the Rabbi of Tripoli, Libya for 20 years, in the year 1690, many years ago. He quotes, he has famous explanation on the Rambam. He says, we don't see anywhere in the Gemara that Shimshon converted his wives. And we do, however, see that in Moed Katan and Yaakov Shemoni as well, that they mention the name of Pinchas like this, and Avol, that a spouse only comes from Hashem. And what does the Yaakov Shemoni, what does the Gemara say? The Gemara says we see 3 locations in the Torah that it's Hashem that makes an actual spouse. In the Torah, the story of Lavan and Bethuel, when Eliezer comes with a match, what do they say? They say, this must be from Hashem. In the story over here, again, one example from Torah and Nevi'im and Kesuvim, Nevi'im is the story of Shimshon. The parents didn't know this came from Hashem, and the Ma'aser Rekeach concludes that Shimshon's match over here, who he got married to, was from Hashem, and obviously she would have gotten married. This was a shidduch. This was a match arranged by Hashem. Of course, she would have converted before he got married to her. If this was Shimshon's actual other half of his soul, as we explain what marriage is, then of course she would have converted before Shimshon got married to her. The Radak, Rashi, Ralbag, Metzudas David, Malbim, many, many more, all of them are very much the same opinion. Shimshon converted his wife from Timnah before he married to her. The Ralbag adds that Chalila, very sharply, Chalila to say that someone who is a judge of the Jewish people would have married a non-Jewish woman, which is a sin from the Torah, especially someone who's a Nazir of Hashem. So the Ralbag is very firm on this, and all the most of the authoritative rabbis who explain the verses in the Nach say that, of course, Shimshon's wife converted. The Abarbanel, though, says she did not convert. Or we don't see that she converted. And we see many stories in Tanakh where people did things that were against Torah in the service of Hashem, and Shimshon employed a harasha, just as Eliyahu Hanavi, against Torah, made a sacrifice outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Beis HaMikdash very much existed, and Eliyahu said, this is a time to show the Jewish people the greatness of Hashem, and so he made an exception to the law, one-time exception. Shimshon did the same thing, and so the Bible is not overly concerned. Of course, it's forbidden in a normal scenario for anyone to do this. You can't, but people have to follow Torah, absolutely. In the case of Shimshon, a Torah authority, a person imbued with the Ruach HaKodesh, he was able to employ a harasha, a temporary, one-time exception to the Torah law, and she didn't convert before. And Shimshon wasn't worried, and she said, this is good in my eyes. The Chidah says that Shimshon actually saw that this was his destined match, and he went after his eyes when he did it. But had he not, he would have merited that she would have converted properly. This was Shimshon's actual destined match according to Chidah. Now, of course, Shimshon's parents are absolutely devastated, and the Malbim divides Manoach and Selalfoinus' issue into 3 parts. Number 1, is there no one among the tribes of the Jewish people for you to marry? Why are you running off to the Plishtim to get married? What's going on? And number 2, the Plishtim are an enemy. Manoach and Selalfoinus tell Shimshon, you're not just marrying anyone, you're marrying someone who is horrible to the Jewish people. And point number 3 is that they are uncircumcised. In fact, the Tosefta Nedarim says, you see how disgraceful the foreskin, the uncircumcised bris is to the Jewish people, Moshe could have said so many dreadful things about the Plishtim. They were murderers, they were adulterers, they were so cruel to the Jewish people, and the stories that happened before and the stories that happened later, each one is more devastating than the next throughout history. And Moshe didn't mention any. The only thing he mentioned about how distasteful and horrible it would be for Shimshon to get married into that nation is that they're uncircumcised, which is very, very interesting. Shimshon tells his parents that he still wants to marry. And the parents were devastated. And the Gemara Yerushalmi says that Shimshon's parents brought Shimshon to Timnah, to the edge of Timnah, to the vineyards in Timnah, and they actually showed Shimshon the vineyards in Timnah to try to illustrate to Shimshon that he needs to take this back, he shouldn't be doing this. And they told him, they said, look at the vineyards. The vineyards are planted with kilayim. There's a law in the Torah, you're not allowed to have a vineyard mixed with other plants as well. You can't just plant vineyards and other trees and other plants in the same areas of it. You need to separate it. You have the vineyards here and you have your wheat over there. And they pointed to the edge of the city of Timnah, where this girl was from, and they told him, they said, son, just as these vineyards have kilayim, just as there's mixed types inside their vineyards, so too their daughters are a product of kilayim. They're not careful about adultery, and so you're marrying into a culture, and you're marrying into a people who are not careful in the slightest about mixed types. So the verse says, Shimshon went down and his father and mother to Timnah and came to the vineyards of Timnah. So this is what Yaakov is talking about. But then they split. Shimshon went his way and his parents walked through the field itself. We'll talk about this. And suddenly Shimshon sees a young lion roaring towards him. And the spirit of Hashem came mightily upon him, and he tore the lion like it would have been a baby goat, a kid. And he had nothing in his hands. Shimshon said he wasn't holding any weapons that he attacked, that defended himself against the lion that was attacking him. And once it was all over and he re-met up with his parents, he didn't tell his father and his mother what he had done. Like the incredible miracle, he doesn't mention anything. Now, of course, the big question is, why weren't Shimshon's parents with him during the lion attack? So the Ruach says that Shimshon went ahead. He went ahead of his parents, and his parents were behind, and he was ahead. That's why they didn't see the whole thing. And the Malbim says that Shimshon came to the vineyard. His parents showed him this incredible analogy and pointed to the way the vineyards in Timnah were. And then his parents made their way through the vineyard. But Shimshon, because he was a Nazir and grapes are forbidden, he didn't even want to walk through the vineyard, through the fields. He said, "I'm a Nazir. I don't want to even come close to any form of temptation to have grapes or to have any product from grapes." And so Shimshon made his way around the entire vineyard while his parents, who no longer were restricted by any Nazir laws, walked through the actual field itself. So Shimshon was alone on the side of the vineyard while his parents were walking through. He was all alone. No one was ever there. The Ruach says the word Veshasa, tore, means that Shimshon actually tore the lion into two pieces. Most people imagine that Shimshon just, killed the lion. He didn't just kill it. He tore the lion into actually two pieces. And the Ruach brings the proof from Kabbanis, the laws of Vayikra, the bird offering, where you see that the Torah actually says the word Veshasa, tore, and the Torah says, no, don't actually tear it into two pieces, which means every other place where we use the word obviously means that it's literally torn into two pieces. And the Babylon sort of say the fact that Shimshon in the verse doesn't actually make a big deal, it shows Shimshon's incredibleness. He didn't make a fuss of this. It was no big deal. Yeah, he tore a lion into two pieces that was trying to attack him. That was no big deal at all. Now, the Ma'am La'ez brings down that there's different opinions in regards to when the first time Shimshon experienced strength. I mentioned that even before the story began, when Shimshon was very young, he was already experiencing, the bell of prophecy, the spirit of Hashem was coming to and from him, and he already at a young age started experiencing these incredible feats of strength. But there are opinions that say that the story of the lion is actually the first time. They disagree with that famous Gemara in Saita, and they say this is the first story. This was a really pivotal moment for Shimshon. It explains why later on Shimshon comes back to this place, because this was the first time where he experienced a tremendous rush of strength, where he did something absolutely incredible. He defended himself against the lion and actually tore it into two. And there's, of course, a massive discussion about whether the lion was a warning to Shimshon that what he was doing was not a good idea. Like Shimshon's heading in towards the city to go meet his future wife. And according to the Alshich, the fact that the lion came to attack him was a sign from Hashem, you're not going about this the right way. Or the Abarbanel, who says on the opposite extreme, that the fact that the lion came and then Shimshon was able to defeat it was a sign. Hashem was sending Shimshon a sign. This is the type of success you're going to experience in the story that you're now beginning. It's Hashem kind of sending Shimshon a green light, like you're doing a great thing, and this is what you could expect when you're attacking the Plishtim. He went down, he talked to the woman. That's one reading of the verse. And Shimshon, and there's the woman, the future wife of Shimshon, pleased Shimshon very much. Rashi says he spoke to her relatives about her. He wanted to investigate, so he spoke to the relatives about her, and that's how he became very pleased with his future wife. The Radak says he spoke to his relatives in order to get married, and he spoke to her to convince her to marry. And the Metzudas and the Malbim both say that he spoke to her, and in addition to her being agreeable based on sight, he had seen her from afar, never talked to her yet, and decided this is the person he wants to get married to. In addition to that, she was also extremely agreeable in wisdom and refined character. So according to the Metzudas David and the Malbim, again, as we're going to progress through the story, you're going to see why this is going to be a little challenging to understand. Shimshon talked to her, and she was extremely wise and extremely refined personality, and Shimshon then decided that this is very good, this is something that should move forward. Time went by. After a while, and we'll talk about what a while means, Shimshon returned to actually get married to her. So he first got engaged to her, and in those days, engagement wasn't an actual engagement; it was a real commitment, and it was a real bond. Now they actually would have had to get divorced because of that eros and because of the first marriage commitment that they had, but the actual wedding hadn't taken place. And so Shimshon makes his way back to Timnah. And when he comes there, he turns to the side. Remember, there's a vineyard, and now the vineyards, all the grapes aren't there, so technically Shimshon could have walked through the field, but this time he actually turns to the side. He wants to go back to the place where this incredible miracle happened to him, and he wants to see the carcass of the lion. And when he goes there, he sees the most incredible sight. There's a swarm of bees inside the actual body of the lion, and there's honey. The bees are all swarming. There's actual honey inside the swarm of a bee. There's the swarms of bees within the lion itself, which is a very, very uncharacteristic things. And it says, by Yudehu El Kapov, he scooped it, sticky thing, he scooped it up and went on and eating as he went. He came to his parents and he gave it to them, and they ate, and he didn't tell them what the story was, neither where the honey had come from, neither the original story that he hadn't told them anyway about how he defeated the lion. Shimshon doesn't mention any of that. There are Bagam Sian says that Shimshon gave his wife 12 months, that was the custom, to prepare herself for the actual wedding. And now, after 12 months, Shimshon made his way back. The Malbim, as I just mentioned before, says there were no grapes in the vineyard. Shimshon could have technically walked through, so why did he walk around? And the reason is, Shimshon wanted to make the bracha she'aseh nes. He wanted to thank Hashem. Shimshon had an incredible miracle. According to some opinions, it was the first time he'd ever seen a miracle like this happen. He had never experienced great strength in his life. This was his first time. And Hashem had done a tremendous miracle for him, and I've gratitude to Hashem. He wanted to come back to the place where the miracle had happened, which is something that the rabbis tell us we should do. And Shimshon came there so he can make the blessing Hashem for the tremendous miracle that had happened to him. The Medrash, in fact, says that when Shimshon saw the side of the lion with the honey inside, he already noticed the interestingness of this. He thought to himself, a lion eats all the other animals, and now he has honey coming from it. He actually mirrored this to the story of Aaron in the desert. With that Aaron, all the sacrifices, he ate all the sacrifices and became a sacrifice himself. Really, really interesting mirroring and contrast that Shimshon has. But when he beheld the side of the lion with the honey inside, it's not just important because the wedding and the riddle is going to very much be hinged upon this interesting sight. Shimshon himself was very beheld by this sight. He looked at this and he was really, really shaken by this strange occurrence of a lion and yet honey. And the pasuk reiterates, Shimshon didn't tell his parents where he'd gotten the honey from in the body of the lion. And again, this later on in the upcoming podcast is going to be extremely important because you're going to see Shimshon's going to use this as a very, very strong weapon to tell his wife, Even my parents don't know about the story of the honey and the story of the lion. So Shimshon didn't tell anyone. The only person who knew about this entire event was Shimshon himself.